Right on business life, rising inflation will not subside without further monetary policy tightening by the Bank of Ghana. We have details from IC Research. Return to fiscal responsibility law now to save the Bank of Ghana. That's a call on government from the Director for the Institute of Statistical, Social and Economic Research, Professor Peter Kwate.
The Fiscal Responsibility Act has to be revisited. That's the point we are making, that yes, it has to be there. Then the Bank of Ghana itself had an act.
Plus, World Bank expected to complete review of government flagship programs by end of next month, a move expected to impact on revised expenditure targets for the year.
So have working with the World Bank a complete review of all the flagship programs, and we hope that by the end of September we'll get a sense of what.
We have details of these and many others coming your way, all in a moment, please. Thanks for your company. I am Pius Kojobaka. Let's now settle for the details. And without a further monetary policy research, we shall bring you more. Without a further monetary policy tightening by the Bank of Ghana, the rise in inflation will not subside. That's according to research firm IC Research. Now, the Monetary Policy Committee baseline forecast shows a slightly higher elevated profile in the year ahead. Here's more.
It said the upside risk could become embedded in underlying inflationary pressures if not contained with further policy tweaks. The recent inflation expectation survey by the Bank of Ghana indicated that business expectations of inflation remain flat at an elevated level. IC Research believes the unchanged inflation expectations reflect the favorable impact of the 4 consecutive months of decline, which was offset by supply side and tax-induced inflation upticks in the past 2 months. It added that the renewed spike in crude oil prices on the global market, with Brent crude reaching $85, could revive non-food inflation with higher utility tariffs under the baseline. Essentially, the inflation monster has been only dazed by ongoing fiscal and monetary tightening, but will not be finished off without further policy tightening.
Now, the World Bank is expected to complete a review of government flagship projects by the end of next month. The move is part of ongoing support from the country's development partners to help reduce government's rising expenditure. Now, some of the projects being covered under this review is the Free SHS initiative and the school feeding program. Finance Minister Ken Ofori-Atta disclosed this on GTV's Current Affairs program, Talking Point.
Look at what you call the primary expenditure, which was about 20.6% of the revenue. We have been able through this period to reduce it to 16.3%. So that's a huge percentage of GDP that has occurred through that period. So yes, in terms of having an eye on how MNDAs spend money, the way in which contracts are approved, you know, the things that you would not see, which really has a huge impact on our costs, are being tackled. And then we also have, working with the World Bank, a complete review of all the flagship programs, and we hope that by the end of September we'll get a sense of what that is, for us then to take action as to efficiencies and leakages that we must do. I don't think anybody is committed to keeping expenditures high. We need to constantly drive towards those efficiencies, and more importantly also increasing revenues. Because if you look at our current budget, I think we are adjusting by almost 3.8% in this first year, and that is huge by any standard, so that we move to minus 0.5% for the primary balance. So there's rigor in what we are doing. We expect that by the time we get these assessments and analysis, we will be even more surgical in the things we do. I think most of the clamor has been reduce the number of ministries, etc., etc.
Something that can be tangibly seen. Yes.
According to people. What can be tangibly seen, Doc, would be that 3 or 4 ministers may not be there, but the 650,000 civil servants will not change. You know, so that's also the reality of the numbers. So when we sit at the Ministry of Finance or Cabinet and look at issues of primary expenditure and begin to bring that down, that really goes to structural changes that we are confronting.
All right, so let's stay on this further. Let's get on Zoom and speak to economist Dr. Patrick Esumen for more on this. Dr. Esumen, grateful you could join me on Business Live. First off, do you hold the view that in reviewing expenditures, initiatives such as the free SHS and the school feeding program must be touched? Do you think so?
Good evening and good evening to viewers. Thanks for having me. I think the first thing I want to say is a little bit of a surprise that after all the clamoring by Ghanaians for the flagship program to be reviewed, the government has chosen the path that is the World Bank that should be doing the review. I find that a little curious because, you know, these are programs for Ghanaians, and a lot of different stakeholders have called for review of various a number of these flagship programs, which hasn't happened. So I think it's quite surprising that that is the path that the government has chosen, that the World Bank should be the one to review it. But specifically to your question, I think, you know, the review should not necessarily mean, cutting the expenditure lines, or it might simply be a realignment. And I think when we are reviewing, all the flagship programs should be on the board. You shouldn't be saying that, oh, we've set this aside. I think, specifically in terms of free SHS, we have to question whether, you know, there's some model for targeting that will be available that can be implemented, or, you know, the current mode is working. We hear the complaints every day about, you know, students struggling with food shortages and other things. So definitely a review of those programs are necessary.
And it fits into my next question, because these programs really are social intervention programs, and we understand that to compensate the poor, the World Bank is also pushing for LEAP to be increased. Do you think this will make the vulnerable better off?
I think, the LEAP increment is very important, but we already seen that this year the government we've seen a substantial increase in both the number of beneficiaries as well as the amount. I think, if I recall correctly, the amount has been doubled. And I think that is good. But, you know, we have to understand that when we implement an IMF program like we are doing, there's going to be a lot of casualties. So it's important that, as contained in the IMF document itself, measures are taken to cushion the poor. But, you know, I think it comes down to the premise of your question, that there are cases where we need the rich, the relatively better off, to subsidize the poorer. And I think that is where people have questioned whether the free SHS, asking people who could ordinarily afford to take their children to some of the best schools in the country, simply not to pay anything at all, when they themselves said that they could pay. Because if those kind of payments were permitted, then it makes it easier for you to support the poorer ones, and then the program will become self-sustaining. As it is, I think government decision to absorb all those costs is part of the reason why there's free SHS. In spite of how much we've been spending on it, the program really seems to be in some kind of trouble.
I see. Dr. Esumen, if you are to give some advice, which areas would you suggest should have a cut in expenditure for the rest of the year?
So, well, I think that in the spirit of burden sharing, which the finance minister and the government has been preaching, perhaps, you know, my first area would be, you know, rethinking the perks that we pay to political appointees, public sector workers. Because, you know, even though we've heard that there's been some slashes, I think You know, if you look at the burden, the amount of burden that has been put on ordinary Ghanaians is quite substantial. So I think that's one area I would think about. But I know cutting the ministries is a popular area. Maybe I would think of it, or cutting the number of ministers is a popular area. I would probably suggest merging some of the agencies, government agencies, because we've seen a proliferation of government programs to support different aspects, especially businesses, and then some of them seem to be doing similar things. So duplication of those secretariats is some area we should look at. But finally, we also have to think about, when we talk about the expenditure rationalization, it's not really only about cutting expenditures, but making sure that we are getting value from public expenses. So we have to ensure that when we spend a cedi of public funds, we are getting the value or its worth for the cedi we spend. I think that is another area we should be looking at, making sure that every project that we do, there's a genuine value for money review to ensure that the public purse is not being misused.
Now, the question is that these expenditure cuts are crucial to meeting the requirements for the IMF review next month. Do you think government will pass the test when it will be, or basically what will be the implication if government fails to do that?
Well, I mean, this government doesn't have a very good history of implementing expenditure cuts. I mean, we know at the start of last year, the government promised to cut, some component of public expenditure by 30%. And we learned that it was unable to implement it. So I think maybe strengthening expenditure controls to ensure that the finance ministry has a tighter control over spending, and then especially of budgetary commitments. I think it's one of the things that were highlighted, that the government was not able to rein in on those. So I think strengthening the expenditure controls, we already have we have the laws in the Public Sector Financial Management Act. So doing those controls is going to be very important. But in terms of nominal expenditure cuts, I cannot say that I'm very optimistic that this government will be able to implement substantial cuts.
And what is going to be...
It simply hasn't shown the appetite for that.
All right. And what is going to be the implications if it fails to, cut the expenditure?
I think in some sense, the government signaled its hand at the start of the IMF negotiations by insisting, or at least the communication says that the government has shown a preference for revenue measures over expenditure measures. So to be sure, they are both expenditure and revenue measures, but the government is placing more emphasis on revenue measures. That's to tell us that it doesn't really fancy cutting so much expenditure. So it might be that some marginal reduction in expenditures might be accompanied with pushing a little bit more burden on ordinary Ghanaians by raising more revenue. Of course, there are other ways to raise more revenue without having to impose additional taxes and overburden Ghanaians further. But whether the government will be able to stay committed to doing those hard work remains to be seen. But my sense is that the government will shift the balance more towards raising more revenues than implementing substantial cuts in expenditure.
In raising revenue, you are not suggesting we are going to see increases in taxes, are you?
I mean, we've already seen a lot of increases in taxes. This year alone, we saw those 3 new taxes. And I mean, I don't think that, so put it this way, if you look at last year's budget versus this year's budget, we've seen new tax lines come on board, and we've seen expenditure grow. That should tell you all you need to know about how government intends to implement this IMF program. They want to raise more revenue and not necessarily implement substantial expenditure cuts.
All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Patrick Esumin, for your time here on Business Live. He is an economist speaking to us there. You're still watching Business Live. More after this break. Hello, welcome back. Director for the Institute of Statistical, Social and Economic Research is appealing to government to return to the implementation of the Fiscal Responsibility Law The law, which restricts government from borrowing more than 5% of the previous year's revenue to GDP, was passed to ensure fiscal discipline. Speaking at a press briefing to review the media budget, Professor Quartey urged the governor of the Bank of Ghana to be firm and not breach the law when lending to government. Here is more.
The call from Professor Peter Quartey follows revelation that the bank made some losses last year, partly as a result of its exposure to budget financing and the domestic debt restructuring. The Institute of Statistical, Social and Economic Research has been reviewing the media budget. It recommends some solutions to government that will address the country's budget deficit, high inflation, and concerns of stagnant growth in the private sector. According to Professor Quartey, it's about time the government stick to the law and ensure that the Bank of Ghana laws are not breached.
The Fiscal Responsibility Act has to be revisited. That's the point we are making, that yes, it has to be there. Then the Bank of Ghana itself had an act that it cannot lend more than 5% of its previous year's revenue to government. That would have to be respected strictly. And I believe with these two, we are good to go. This issue of government having to fall on the central bank to finance its deficit by over 80% will be kept if we implement this strategy.
Also responding to the assertion that the economy has turned around the corner, Professor Quartey argued there is more to be done to begin the recovery process.
The point is, if we have turned the corner, then there are many corners we have to turn. We have turned one. There are many corners we have to turn because if you look at the rate of inflation, it is still high comparatively, but if we compare with our peers. Exchange rate depreciation relatively stable, but yes, we have suspended debt payment, debt servicing, and it's very uncertain to what extent the foreign creditors are going to allow a haircut. What are they going to forgive us, and what are they going to ask us to pay? But I'm hoping on the balance of it all that we'll be able to afford and pay and have some stability.
Professor Peter Quartey therefore advised government to take a second look at the electronic transaction levy and broaden its scope to cover e-commerce businesses whilst reducing the rate further.
Winnings on sport betting as well as national lottery are expected to attract 10% withholding tax from August 15. This is because the Ghana Revenue Authority is set to begin enforcing revised tax laws for the gaming industry. There is more in the following reports.
The application of this levy is part of a broader review of the income tax on gaming and lottery operations in the country. The Ghana Revenue Authority in a circular said the passage of the income tax amendment will now result in a 10% on the gross winnings of persons that involved in sports betting and lottery winnings. The withholding tax deduction, according to the authority, applies to winnings paid or payable by private lotto operators, sports betting operators, casino operators, route operators, remote interactive games operators, operators of marketing promotions, and operators of other games of chance. Prior to this, some operators in the industry, including casinos, route operations, and marketing promotions, started the implementation of this policy on June 1, 2023. Sports betting and private lotto operations are also expected to commence the implementation from August 15, 2023. So, for instance, if you placed a bet of 15,000 Ghana cedis in a football match and you ended up winning 60,000 cedis, the application of tax will minus your original stake and subject the remaining amount of 45,000 cedis as the tax. This should mean that 4,500 Ghana cedis will be the amount that you're likely to pay to the state.
Before we go, the Ghana National Chamber of Commerce and Industry has pledged its commitment to deepen collaboration with Multimedia Group Limited to help in articulating issues of national interest. Now, according to the Chamber, the partnership has become critical to the growth and development of the economy. Speaking to Joy Business after the leadership of the Chamber paid a working visit to management of Multimedia Group Limited, President of the Ghana National Chamber of Commerce and Industry, Clement Seamwaku, said his outfit will be signing an MOU with Multimedia, which will focus on advocacy, entrepreneurship, and policy direction to help accelerate economic growth.
A credible institution like this that do most of our coverage and send credible information, I felt that as a private sector, we need to work in harmony with them to support the government in most of the activities they do. And most especially also where we need to criticize. I think that this is also a very good platform for us to tell the government, look, can you look at this way? Some constructive criticism are very important for our nation. And so that they will to straighten the government to know what it must do. Sometimes when you are leading, you might be making some small mistake you don't even know. It is good that we take this opportunity to address the government, to stand tall and be able to work. And where the government is also doing well, we commend them. And so today, as part of our visiting most of the medias, we selected multimedia because for us, they are the best that we know. And so to have some interaction with them, look at the key areas that they are performing, which we can collaborate as a chamber with them. And then work hand in hand to support our members, support Mother Ghana and the world as a whole. And so today we were privileged to have them with us, and we have discussed extensively what we want to do going ahead. And I believe that this meeting is going to help us into the future so that we'll be able to address the nation in the best way, and even the business fraternity.
Thanks so much for your company. I am Pius Kujubaka. You can get stories when you log on to myjoyonline.com/business to enjoy the rest of our programs.